If Australia were a single house, then people would only live right by the front door, and only the truly fearless would dare to step any farther inside. Hello everyone! To describe this unique characteristic of Australia, a special term was even created, the Outback. This word was born in Australia itself, and it is a casual expression used to refer to the remote, hard-to-reach interior regions of the Australian continent. A similar English expression is the back of beyond, which is typically used when talking about places that feel extremely remote, isolated, and almost completely abandoned. Still, it feels quite unusual that most of an entire continent is labeled with a term like this, and that people actually take pride in it. Welcome to our channel. So, why did things end up this way, and why has this situation remained almost unchanged even now, well into the 21st century? Let's explore it together. Now then, let's get started. History of settlement. Australia is the only country in the world that occupies an entire continent as its territory. That said, its land area is still smaller than Antarctica, making it the smallest of all the continents. When you include the island of Tasmania, Australia covers a total area of about 2.97 million square miles. Of course, that is far smaller than the vast expanse of Eurasia, but even so, Australia still ranks as the sixth largest country in the world by land area, behind Russia, Canada, China, the United States, and Brazil. And yet, there is another curious and somewhat puzzling aspect about Australia. Despite its enormous size, its population in 2025 was only around 27.6 million people. Given that, it's no surprise that Australia's population density sits at just around 9.3 people per square mile, placing it among the lowest in the world. Even if we avoid comparing it to extremely dense places like Morocco or Singapore, and instead look at countries with similar land areas, the difference still stands out clearly, with China at around 389 people per square mile, the United States at around 98, and Brazil at roughly 67. So, why is it that a continent surrounded by two vast oceans, and located largely within warm climate zones, has so few people living on it? We will talk about the climate a bit later, but first, let's take a closer look at the history of settlement in Australia. The low population density of this country is deeply connected to its history. The first Indigenous Australians are believed to have arrived on this continent around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. They are thought to have migrated from the islands of Indonesia and New Guinea, yet even for them, this land does not seem to have been especially easy or comfortable to live in. Otherwise, why is it that over tens of thousands of years, they did not domesticate a single native animal? For instance, they could have tried domesticating kangaroos. They would make for incredibly tough and reliable guards, holding their own against MMA fighters, and since they also love relaxing in comfortable spots, much like cats, it might not have been such a bad idea. Well, perhaps their temperament simply wasn't suitable, or there were many different reasons behind it. Even so, over the course of 50,000 years, Indigenous peoples did not form large, centralized states. Because of that, when Captain Cook reached the eastern coast of Australia in 1770, he encountered no large-scale organized resistance and was able to claim the eastern coast with relative ease, declaring it a territory of Britain. At that time, Australia's population is estimated to have ranged from about 315,000 to 750,000 people. But they were divided into roughly 500 tribes, each with its own distinct language. However, it was Arthur Phillip who truly began the systematic colonization of the continent, arriving at Port Jackson in 1788 with a fleet of 11 ships and establishing what would become Australia's largest city, Sydney. At that time, and for many years afterward, almost no one attempted to push into the interior, and development remained focused almost entirely along the coast. In this way, settlements were established along rivers and bays, with a town that would later become Melbourne taking shape along the Yarra River, Brisbane being founded in Moreton Bay, and the Swan River colony eventually developing into what is now Perth. It is clear that European Australians had little desire to move away from the coastal regions. The climate there was mild, water was readily available, the ocean was always nearby, and the landscape reminded them of their familiar European homelands, making it a comfortable place to settle. Later on, the British government designated Australia as a penal colony, and large numbers of convicted criminals were transported there. As a result, convicts and their descendants came to make up a significant portion of Australia's population. Meanwhile, the indigenous population declined rapidly, and on the island of Tasmania, they almost completely disappeared. As exploration of Australia continued, the new rulers became increasingly convinced that it was far wiser to remain along the coasts rather than attempt to push deep into the vast and arid interior. In 1862, an expedition led by the Scottish explorer John McDougall Stuart crossed the Australian continent from north to south, attempting to locate substantial and reliable water sources, but the effort ultimately ended in failure. Throughout the entire journey, which stretched across thousands of miles, the expedition failed to discover even a single large body of water. Because of all this, by the mid-19th century, around 400,000 non-Indigenous Australians were living primarily along the coastal regions. The Gold Rush and racial discrimination laws. However, everything changed dramatically in 1851 when gold was discovered in New South Wales. Australia, once known primarily as a penal colony, was suddenly transformed into a land of gold and opportunity. As a gold rush even larger than the one in California took off, Australia's population surged tenfold in just a single decade. New cities like Ballarat and Bendigo sprang up almost overnight, and infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and railways began to spread rapidly across the region. From that point on, Australia continued exporting gold to global markets, and even today it consistently ranks among the world's top 3 gold producers. How many major countries can you think of whose modern economy essentially began with a gold rush on this scale? In that sense as well, Australia stands out as an extremely unusual and distinctive country. At the same time, however, gold also brought with it a number of serious social problems. One of those issues was the arrival of large numbers of immigrants from China who came to work in the goldfields. Chinese immigrants quickly became strong and formidable competitors to the European settlers. At first, many of the Chinese worked in gold mining, but over time, they began moving into agriculture and small-scale businesses. In an effort to limit the growing economic presence of Asian immigrants, Australia's white-led government felt they had no choice but to resort to enacting a series of racially discriminatory laws. At first, individual states enacted these measures, and later, the central government of Australia followed suit, introducing laws that restricted so-called non-white immigrants, particularly those of Chinese origin. The first time such laws were applied across all of Australia was in 1901. Under these rules, immigration by non-white individuals was heavily restricted, and anyone the government judged to have entered the country unlawfully was subject to deportation. On top of that, immigrants were required to pass tests in European languages, along with various other restrictive conditions. Naturally, the primary purpose of these language tests was not to assess literacy, but to exclude non-Europeans from entering the country. As a result of these racially discriminatory policies, commonly referred to as the White Australia policy, immigration from Asian countries remained extremely limited all the way up until the 1970s. The ban on immigration from Asia ultimately became one of the factors that slowed settlement in Central Australia, holding back both industrial and agricultural development in those regions. Although many of these racial restrictions were officially abolished by law after 1975, the effects of their introduction continued to linger for a long time afterward. Even today, people of Chinese descent make up less than 5.5% of Australia's population. The biggest barrier to settlement. However, the main reason why most of the Australian continent was never settled comes down to one dominant factor: its dry and unforgiving climate. The defining feature of Australia, both in the past and even today, lies in its geographic position and the climate conditions that naturally arise from it. That is because roughly 70 to 80% of this continent is covered by arid deserts and semi-desert regions. These areas receive very little rainfall, while evaporation rates remain extremely high, which leads to frequent and prolonged periods of drought. The driest regions on Earth are known to be the Sahara Desert and the Arabian Desert. The Sahara receives an average of about 1 inch of rainfall per year, while the Arabian Desert gets less than 4 inches annually. When it comes to dryness, Australia is not all that different from these harsh regions. About 40% of its land receives less than 10 inches of rainfall each year, and around 70% gets less than 20 inches annually. With such low levels of precipitation, it becomes impossible to grow crops without relying on irrigation systems. In terms of temperatures as well, much of Australia closely resembles some of the hottest desert environments on the planet. During the summer, temperatures in those regions often exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some areas, they can climb as high as 122 degrees. Under the blazing sun, the soil becomes completely dried out and lifeless, and even if large amounts of water arrive occasionally, irregular irrigation alone cannot make this land suitable for agriculture. However, across most of Australia, irrigation farming can only be practiced on a very limited scale. The fundamental reason that holds back the development of irrigation agriculture is a simple but critical one: the lack of available water. It is not uncommon for an exhausted traveler looking out across the landscape to assume that a valley ahead must surely contain a flowing river. And indeed, a valley carved by a river may appear before them, yet there is no water to be found. These are what is known as creeks, rivers that are usually dry, similar to the Wadis found in the Sahara Desert. The most well-known river system, the Murray-Darling Basin, can supply water only to a very limited part of southeastern Australia. And even then, that water mainly supports the coastal regions. Meanwhile, beneath the vast, sun-scorched interior plateau of Australia lies the Great Artesian Basin. This underground water source holds great promise and hope for Australia, but that is something for the future. In reality, extracting artesian groundwater at present costs far more than the benefits it can provide. There have even been bold and ambitious proposals to use seawater to fill the Lake Erie Basin. In theory, it would require digging a canal stretching across hundreds of miles, but the question remains: where would the billions of dollars needed for such a project come from? And even if such a canal were built, would the water actually make it all the way to the lake? Or would it simply evaporate along the way before getting there? Poor and exhausted soils. Alongside the harsh climate conditions, another major factor comes into play: the complex and nutrient-poor nature of the soil itself. The soils of Australia are among the oldest on Earth, and also among the most depleted in nutrients. This is largely because, compared to other continents, Australia's geological structure is relatively uniform and lacks variety. About 2/3 of the landmass consists of Precambrian platforms, regions that have not experienced major crustal deformation for hundreds of millions of years. On most other continents, folded mountain ranges have formed and transformed over time, deep geosynclines have shifted, and coastlines have constantly changed. But across most of Australia, there has been almost no significant tectonic activity, with geological change limited mainly to denudation processes, meaning the gradual weathering, erosion, and deposition of broken-down rock. For hundreds of millions of years, this region has seen neither active tectonic movements nor volcanic activity, and no glaciers have formed here. Because of that, the kind of large-scale renewal of soil layers that occurred on other continents simply did not take place across much of Australia. As a result, the soils that developed are poor in nutrients and often contain high levels of salt that are harmful to agriculture. Even if favorable conditions briefly appear and a fertile layer manages to form, a lack of moisture combined with intense heat quickly degrades the soil, making it unsuitable for farming. When fertile soil deteriorates this rapidly, it requires intensive irrigation and heavy fertilization to maintain productivity, which is extremely difficult to sustain. Because of this, the efforts of many determined settlers ultimately ended in failure, and the boundaries of land suitable for agriculture gradually retreated once again toward the coastal regions. With low yields and little hope for successful development, there was simply no point in remaining in such lands, so people continued to cluster together in the already established and more livable coastal areas. The economics and psychology of space. That said, the modern Australian economy does not particularly need to develop new land in order to thrive and function effectively. With a population of under 30 million people, the already vast coastal regions alone provide more than enough space to support the country's needs. As is well known, Australia consistently ranks among the top 20 countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita. Its economy runs smoothly on a combination of mineral resource extraction, agriculture concentrated in coastal areas, a strong financial and service sector, and a well-developed industrial base. Unlike countries that struggle with overpopulation, Australia has no pressing need to push into and develop its internal desert regions. Building thousands of miles of roads, along with power lines and water infrastructure, just to open up new territories simply does not make economic sense. It is far more practical to continue using and improving the infrastructure that already exists along the coast. It's also worth pointing out that many Australians see the vast, empty interior that covers most of the continent as a kind of natural blessing rather than a problem. There's a clear reason why Australians came up with the term Outback to describe these inland desert regions. For them, the remote and desolate interior is seen as a unique and defining part of their national identity. The untouched nature of the Outback has become a powerful symbol that sets Australia apart from other countries and cultures, and it is deeply reflected in the nation's cultural heritage. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to leave a like and share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.